So really the idea in writing this book was that we'd been studying trade for a very long time, and between us we'd had this discussion that there was a link between trade and geopolitical risk. We could see that trade was affected by geopolitical events. And what seemed to be happening over the last 14 months in particular, and over the period since Brexit and since the election of Donald Trump, is a kind of rhetorical escalation of language. So we're looking at, instead of talking about globalisation as opportunities for all and win-win and being able to create economic growth and economic development, we're really looking at trade being seen as a way of protecting a country. National interest has crept in, and some of the language around war.
Yeah, and you had, in particular, the conflation of trade with elements to do with national security, and very much the idea of protectionism. Trade policies became unfair. You had trade partners becoming de facto enemies. And we found that the rhetoric in particular was becoming increasingly aggressive, even belligerent. And that's where we got the title, the Weaponization of Trade.
And what we mean about the weaponisation of trade is partly what we're seeing in the rhetoric. I think that's very important to stress that this is something materially different to what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, we saw both a literal and a figurative weaponisation. So, as Rebecca just mentioned, figuratively the trade was being weaponised through the rhetoric. And the very first quote at the beginning of the book was a fantastic one from Donald Trump, who railed against China for taking billions off the US but doing nothing for them in terms of resolving the North Korea situation. And indeed we even saw the same thing in Saudi Arabia with Theresa May, who justified billions of dollars worth of arms exports because it was essential to the British national interest. So you had this figurative weaponization through the conflation of trade with security. But more than that, we also saw a literal weaponization of trade. And in the book, in particular, we investigate the arms trade. And trade, although it's always been something that could be considered coercive, we actually investigated the targeted exports of the arms trade to different states in the world that are deemed to be of strategic importance. And we sort of compared this with the classical definition of conflict. So if war is coercive, political, instrumental and violent, then we actually found that trade, in the sense that we've investigated it, adhered to many of these definitions or these criteria. And although not necessarily in terms of the direct violence, that's possibly where the definition fell down slightly, but definitely in terms of indirect violence. So you can supply the means for violence to particular states in the world. And this was particularly crucial in an era when protracted military campaigns in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq have actually undermined the political will for direct engagement. So trade, in essence, became the tool or the means used in the pursuit of political ends. So in that sense, we had a literal weaponization of trade.
One of the key things that we're stressing in this book is that trade has always been linked with foreign policy. There is an extent to which we're seeing something very different that's happening now, and a lot of that is around the rhetorical use of the words that are associated with war conflated with trade. The other thing that's happening is that trade is actually being used explicitly as a tool of foreign policy, as opposed to almost covert and implicit uses in the past.
I think that's crucial, actually, is the difference between the implicit and the explicit. So trade has always been a tool of foreign policy, and we're not arguing to the contrary. I mean, even the title is The Great Unbalancing of Politics and Economics. The implication, of course, being that they have been balanced in the past. So it's always had coercive elements. And in fact, back in 1945, you had Albert Hirschman, who wrote that relations of domination and dependence arise out of trade relations. So trade's always been crucial in creating power. But what's substantively different now is that the implicit understanding of the power of trade has been trumped, if you like, by the explicit conflation, again, of trade with strategy and foreign policy.
So to prove the case, we've used a variety of different sources of evidence. And in particular, we've relied substantially on a database that mirrors world trade and looks at trade around the world, 200 countries, 12,800 products and sectors, and allows us to understand some of the areas of trade, because of the way the data is mirrored, that other data sets actually can't see. So the evidence is actually in things like military trade, dual-use goods trade, arms and ammunitions trade. We can see evidence of strategic intent within those sectors. There's another area as well. The book contains some very interesting interview material from 20 political leaders, business leaders, all of whom have been at some point in their life involved with trade or diplomacy. And their view is that trade is at an inflection point. And that inflection point is either an end to globalisation or a way forward through the global means that we have at the moment. And that actually tells us that this is a very important moment in time to be publishing a book like this.
And the final piece of evidence is all in the public domain. Just have a quick look at Donald Trump's Twitter feed. The evidence is right there for all to see.
So we have found through our interviews and through the data that trade is at an inflection point. There is a real danger that if we go down a route of economic nationalism and bilateralism, as opposed to the multilateralism that so many of the post-World War, Second World War institutions have been built on, that we actually undermine some of the things that we have taken for granted in the last 20 or 30 years since the end of the Cold War. A lot of the people that we spoke to who are being interviewed argued that we are at a moment of crisis, and maybe that crisis is severe enough now to make people realise how important multilateralism is and will be in the future. But the decision point is there and in the hands of politicians to make the right choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think trade is most powerful when it strikes a balance between politics and economics. And unfortunately, I think the current rhetoric is in danger of actually unbalancing that relationship in favour of the politics. And I think we need to try and return to a stage when we reconnect the economics and the politics, rather than seeing it as a purely political and coercive vehicle.
And I think I'd add to that with one point on policy. How can this now be changed? We need to change this by politicians actually being aware of the power of their rhetoric. some humility needs to be shown, some understanding of the fact that if you put on Twitter the fact that you're going to stop trading with everyone who trades with North Korea, it does actually have consequences. It raises the temperature. There is a danger of escalation. Now, the book also contains some recommendations for the regulatory structures around trade, so that banks understand where they can fund things and where they can't fund things. But the most important thing here is that politicians need to be aware of the power of their words, that populism is one thing, dealing with populism through rhetoric is dangerous, and that trade being weaponised is not a good thing.